right, find my mute key there. Sorry about the echo. I'm not sure if it's gone away or if it's gotten better for you all. Yeah, my name is Liz Westberg, and I am here to present Oops, I Sprouted Again in classic millennial fashion. I did consider some other possible titles, including Trim Me More, and maybe a few other bad 2000s pop songs, but this is the one I eventually landed on. And we are here to talk about the science of why exactly trees grow back the way they do, why they sprout so quickly, especially after pruning. So for myself, I collect a fair number of hard hat stickers. I am a utility arborist specifically, and I work for a company called Grow Solutions. We do tree growth regulators, and I bring this up mostly because this is how I really got into talking about this subject. I despise being asked questions that I don't know the answer to because I really love knowing the answer to things and being able to help people and educate them. So this presentation really got started in my days as a trainer and quality assurance inspector for our team at Grow Solutions. My technicians would ask questions, and I had to have to really dig to find some answers about some of the best ways to select trees for treatment with TGRs. So that's how I got going in this subject. Now, amongst my hard hat stickers, you'll note that I do not have a PhD. I am not a researcher. I am not an academic in that regard, but what I am is willing to speak on this subject, willing to get up in front of people and talk about this. And I think I'm fairly effective at breaking down some of these concepts. So by all means, hit me up with your questions. If I don't know how to answer them, maybe it'll turn into a new presentation over the course of the next couple of years. So why are we talking about this? Again, I'm a utility arborist, so most of my world revolves around trees and power lines. But this is relevant to anybody who does, plant healthcare work with trees, as well as folks who do structural pruning with trees. But in the world of utilities, epicormic sprouts, these water sprouts that pop up, they can really ruin our day and ruin especially the prune cycle. Whether a utility is using a cycle or whether they're doing condition-based management, trees growing back into the power lines is a huge source of where your electric utilities have to go. It's what they have to spend a lot of money on, and so the more we can understand about how to prevent that, the better. Another reason I really want to get into talking about this is because a lot of conversations have to be had with stakeholders, particularly cities that these trees are growing in and property owners of the places these trees grow, to be able to explain why certain management decisions are being made, and understand why the trees are growing back that way and why they might be a problem or what some of the best things might be to do about it in the future. What I'm going to get into today specifically, we're going to start with what is epicormic sprouting. We'll do some technical definitions. What causes it? What's the actual plant physiology happening in the tree that's making it grow that way? Briefly, we'll cover some of my usual suspects, some of the trees that often give us the hardest time in the utility world. And then most importantly, this whole second half of this presentation is going to be what are our control options? What can be done to control epicormic sprouting as it's happening in trees? So let's jump right into it. What is epicormic sprouting? Okay, this is saved in my computer in a whole folder called thattree.jpg. That is a green ash. This is in Minnesota, where I am from, where I'm living. This tree was located across the street from me. I'm looking out the window right now where it used to be. And I took this picture May 12th, 2024. So May 2024. And if you are not a utility arborist in particular, you're probably looking at this picture going, oh my God, what did they do to that poor thing? That's a top right there. That's power line special. It is directly under the power lines. They did what they were going to do. Fast forward only 2 weeks. So May 31st, 2024. And I'll zoom in just a little bit so you can see a little closer here. We've already got about a foot, maybe a foot and a half of regrowth. It's been 2 weeks on this green ash. Anybody who tells you we have a slow growing season in Minnesota is lying, because that's 2 weeks and about a foot and a half resprouted already. Let's bump forward another bit of time here. We have 2 months later, so July of 2024. And you can't even, see the structure of that flat cut that was there anymore, because now we've got several feet of regrowth right up towards the power lines directly under them. And that's just 2 months on this green ash. I did revisit this tree one more time some months later in March of 2025, so about a year later, and there it is now. If you can't see the arrow pointing to the stump, that one finally got removed. It is no longer directly under those power lines, but uh, can't check on it anymore. So this kind of growth, though, is what we're here to talk about. Why we are constantly running into these issues with utilities. Because the truth of the matter is, this tree should have been removed a while ago. Not just because it's under the power lines, but because it's also a green ash tree and was probably going to get infested with emerald ash borer up here anyways. But there's a lot of reasons that this particular utility couldn't just remove it. So over here on the right, you might be able to see there's some signage. There is a light industrial area. This is Edina, Minnesota specifically. And if you've never heard of Edina, it is the cake eater city where the bad guys from the Mighty Ducks live. Now you know. And over here is a light industrial area with some warehouses and some things. Over on the left, where you see more trees and this berm right here, that's a residential area. So these sets of trees had to be left according to the city because they provided a blockage between the industrial and the residential areas. And it's always a big fight between the two to try and get any kind of work done on these trees in particular and other areas just like them. Other places you see this all over the place in the utility world. We've got, sub-transmission line here, another ash tree growing directly under it. We got a mulberry sprouting back aggressively under some power lines. These sorts of things are a daily problem. We call them annual prunes if you're not in the utility side of things, where they have to get pruned at least once, and in some cases down in places like California, a tree like this might even be, pruned twice a year to keep it out of the power lines. So huge amount of resources going into controlling these trees and keeping them out of the lines for, safe, reliable transmission of electricity. So what's happening with these trees? This is not our primary growth. Primary growth of trees occurs in the branch tips up at the meristems, and that's going to be our normal growth. That's just our annual growth of the tree growing under normal, healthy conditions, and it happens up there in the branch tips. Similarly, secondary growth is going to be also called caliper or diameter growth. It occurs in the branches and the stems of the trees and causes it to get wider. But what we're talking about is a different kind of growth entirely. It's epicormic growth. So the definition of our epicormic growth, or our epicormic sprouts, are going to be shoots that are growing from dormant or latent buds. Those are kind of the two terms I hear most frequently. And these can occur pretty much anywhere along the stems or branches of these trees. These are all going to be growth spots from places that were formerly buds, formerly lateral buds, or branches on the tree, whether the branches are there or not anymore at all. And they most commonly occur after events like pruning. So one of the cool things that trees do, and other plants as well, to survive is they create these clusters of epicormic or dormant buds that are behind each of this year's current buds, and then they just stay there for years. So these buds are tiny. You'll see them forming along terminal bud scars from previous years and behind buds from current years, and then they just stay there for decades in some cases, waiting for literally their chance in the sun to grow when the tree needs to regrow a branch in that spot. So taking a look at this crosscut of a branch from a paper written by Meyer back in 2012. I have a reference for that later on if you want to go check it out yourself. These buds, they're inhibited from growth by hormones that are produced in the apical meristem. And I'll talk more about auxin suppression in a few slides. But what happens is the upper branches of the trees are producing a hormone that prevents these from growing. They do grow just enough year after year so that they stay just under the bark of a branch or of the stem so that they're ready to go if needed. So taking a look at this picture here, the letters C, you can see these kind of rays running through the wood. These are dormant buds that are still near the surface of the branch. D is one that might have come forth a few years ago. A is one that died off a few years ago and is just kind of stuck in the rings of this old branch. Every tree has what this paper refers to as a bud bank. And a bud bank is a collection of these epicormic or these dormant buds hanging out just beneath the surface. And we'll measure them by the number of dormant buds per meter. So if you stretch your arms out wide, and I know my camera can't get all of me, but you have about a meter of an arm span. And if you think about how many buds might be in that length of branch, come up with the number at the top of your head. I've heard guesses in the tens and twenties, maybe even 100 or so. You're not too far off if that's kind of where your head was. So a tree like Quercus petrea, which is a sessile oak, it's one of the European ones. Don't quote me on that. This one has 50 to 70 buds per meter. So again, thinking about a meter or a yard, that's 50 to 70 potential new branches in just that 1 meter of tree. That's on the low end. Then we have a eucalyptus tree. And if you haven't seen eucalyptus trees, then you either haven't been to California or Australia. They're actually really cool trees. They're from Australia. They're cool where they belong. In California, they are kind of a big problem. But these things, they have 300 buds per meter or more. So that's 300 potential new branches that this tree could produce if needed. And the thing about this is that they're like hydras, right? Like the ancient Greek monster. You cut off one head and three more grow back in its place. Every time you cut off a branch and these epicormic buds burst forth, it creates new dormant buds beneath the new growth. So it's always going to be capable of doing this. It's not a one and done kind of thing. It will just continue to resprout. So why does it do this? Why are trees programmed to have this behavior and make this happen? The really short answer is plant hormones. I'm going to mention a couple of the plant hormones. If we were in person, this is the part where I would toss candy at the audience for trying to guess if they know all 5 plant hormones. I do not have any kind of teleportation machines. I can't do that today, so I'll just tell you what they are. Abscisic acid, auxins, cytokinins, ethylenes, and gibberellins. Botanists would tell you that there are actually 7 big classes of plant hormones. I don't care. These are the 5 that I'm going to talk about most when I'm doing tree education. And today specifically, I'll mention a lot more about auxins. I'm not using the right screen. Auxins and gibberellins. Those are the 2 that are going to have the biggest effects on our resprouting process. So, what happens with epicormic growth? These buds remain dormant until a stressor activates them. And there's any number of things that can cause enough stress in a tree to activate these buds. Number 1 is going to be canopy or root mass loss. So pruning a tree or a tree losing a part of its canopy in a windstorm, similar things like that. Illness or infestations. You think about emerald ash borer in particular. I have some pictures of that coming up as well. Drought and excess cold. These are all going to be things that are known stressors to cause epicormic sprouting in numerous species. So response to pruning in particular, you'll often hear these called water sprouts. That's not a technical term. I've always learned it that water sprouts are the sprouts that come out of the tree branches or higher up in the stem, and suckers are the ones that come off of the roots. Again, those aren't really technical definitions, but that's what we're going to use for today's purposes. So this is going to be your regrowth in response to canopy loss or the other stressing factor. And what's happening here is that trees are dumb. And what I mean is they don't know a lot about what's going on with them. For all the information that they can gather in from the forest floor and all these things, they don't necessarily know what's directly above them. A tree growing in someone's yard doesn't know that it's the only tree in that yard and is directly under power lines. It still thinks it could be in a forest where it's competing for valuable resources with other trees. And if you think back to any forestry classes you may or may not have ever taken, you'll remember that the number 1 limiting resource for a tree in a forest isn't water, it isn't nutrients, it's sunlight. So specifically canopy space. There's a lot of growth habits that have evolved in trees to compete for this valuable canopy space to get the sunlight they need to grow. So what's happening with these trees, in short, is you cut off a big chunk of the canopy and the tree goes, oh no, I've lost my canopy. I need to regrow as fast as possible to get back up into that upper canopy area before another tree steals that space from me. So there it goes. And it shoots its branches up as fast as it possibly can to regain that canopy space. So in a nutshell, that's what's happening here. It's the tree's attempt to refill that lost canopy space and make sure it can still get sunlight to grow more in the future. There are 3 kind of main steps in this process. And I'll go over each of these in more detail here. But the first is the removal of that apical dominance caused by the auxins. The second then is going to be the activation of dormant buds just under the surface bark of the tree. And then the third is going to be, come on, there you go, process called cellular elongation in that new shoot growth that causes it to grow back so rapidly in comparison to normal growth. So apical dominance. Up in the tops of the trees, we have our apical meristems. In deciduous trees, there could be many different branches that we might consider apical meristems. But typically, the higher up on a tree, a branch tip is, the more likely it is to have this apical dominance. And what's happening here is these growing areas of the tree produce a lot more hormones than other plant tissues in the tree do, including auxins. Now, auxins, as I told you earlier, are part of what causes those dormant buds to stay dormant. But a big portion of what auxins do is they cause that tree to grow upwards and towards the sunlight. So phototropism, growing towards the sun. And as they're producing this hormone to help it grow towards the sun, it has this kind of downstream effect on the branches below those apical stems or those apical buds that prevents these lateral branches from growing as rapidly as the outermost branch. Again, if you're a tree, you want to put most of your growth energy into the very tippy tops of your branch to be growing upwards and outwards rather than growing more branches inside the canopy or in lower areas. So all these branches downstream from these apical ones are suppressed by the auxins that are being produced in these outer branch tips. So that is apical dominance or auxin suppression. So the second thing that then happens, we remove that auxin suppression and we have a whole new open part of the tree that hasn't been seeing a lot of sunlight until very recently. Now we have these dormant buds that I mentioned earlier in that bud bank. They are able to be activated. They are literally getting their chance in the sun and getting their chance to burst forth. So exposure to sunlight is thought to be part of this, but the removal of the auxins is a big part of it as well. We cut this limb off, and now there's nothing there producing auxins to prevent these buds from growing. Different trees handle this in different ways. I'll say more about that a little bit later as well. But this is how these buds get activated. And then once they are activated and once they're able to grow, we end up with this rapid regrowth. Because as you know, these branches don't just grow back in a nice consistent manner with just one branch. It's going to have good form and good structure. No, they put out a lot of shoots and they grow very rapidly. And this is caused by gibberellins. So the second of the two hormones I mentioned. Gibberellins are responsible for a process called cellular elongation. It's that rapid internodal growth. Now, when I say these tree branches grow back faster, I don't necessarily mean that the cells are dividing quicker. It's not necessarily a speed thing, but as they are dividing and as they're growing, they are stretching out more. So cellular elongation simply means that the plant cells, and we can tell that they're plant cells because they're shaped like bricks. That's how we like to draw them. They get stretched out. They get pulled out longer in that growth process. So you end up with more space internodally or between the buds of these branch tips. And you can see this when you look at these. If you take trimmings from these trees, you'll be able to see a lot more space between the buds and between the terminal scars from previous years. So it's not a speed thing, it's a length of the branches thing, which is kind of a distinction without a difference when we're talking about how quickly the branches get back into the power lines. But that's what's actually happening in the tree after you prune them and why they grow back the way they do so rapidly and with that form. A few rules of thumb you're going to see are some pretty common observations. This is in that same stretch of road that I was talking about earlier. It's a silver maple this time. One of the things you're going to see is that the branches or the buds that are closer to the center part of the stem, the proximal part of the tree, they are going to grow back much more aggressively than these branches on the outer part of the tree if that's where the trimming had occurred. So this is something we see a lot when I'm doing tree selection for tree growth regulators, is when I'm trying to make a decision about which trees are or not good candidates for this. The closer these ones, just like this one, the closer these prune marks are to the power line, to the stem of the tree, the more likely they are to grow back rapidly, the more likely that is to be a good candidate for TGR. So I see a ton of stuff like this and get to answer questions like this all the time for my team. Whereas at the power, if this tree was shifted over a little bit more, maybe, 10, 15 feet to the right, the pruning would have just been the branch tips, and that regrowth would be significantly less aggressive than it is since it's right on that main stem. Another place you're going to see this a lot is as a response to infestations or illness. Anybody on the eastern half of the country is going to see a lot of this if you haven't already. This is, again, a green ash, but this is the response to emerald ash borer infestations. So what's happening is the upper parts of the tree are or have been dying off because all the xylem and phloem are being eaten up by this beetle. And the tree is going to basically try and regrow itself from its stem by putting out epicormic sprouts lower down that it can try and save its root mass at least and grow a new tree and hope that the pest pressure moves on in the future. So EAB and then anthracnose is another one that we'll see a lot of this infestation or this response to illness, epicormic sprouting. Another one we'll see a lot of is going to be, again, called suckers. I've learned that they're called suckers when they happen near the root flare of the tree. Crab apples are notorious for this nonsense. There's a lot of species that do this, but you start hitting the root mass with that lawnmower just once, and you're stuck with these resprouts forever. And again, it's a survival mechanism for the tree to kind of regrow itself if it thinks that there's danger, there's damage happening to it. Very, very hard to control these once they start, of course. Speaking of speaking of stumps of trees and root flares, this is one I see a fair amount as well. Someone goes through the trouble to remove the tree. Maybe there's power lines above this one, but then they leave the stump and they don't do anything to it. A lot of trees are more than capable of regrowing themselves from the leftover root mass if you don't do something about this stump. So you might have something that looks like this, and that might not be a problem for 20 years for those power lines. But soon enough, it's going to look like this. Had one of my technicians send me this picture from Oregon a few years ago. If you can't quite tell what's going on, that's the old stump of a big leaf maple that has since regrown into 5 or 6 fully new big leaf maple trees that are, of course, directly under power lines. And it's Oregon, so it's very, very tough to get removals on these trees. One of the last categories of our resprouts is going to be in response to fire. So this whole category is often referred to as resprouters. These are going to be trees that are evolved to respond to fire in a relatively positive way for them, at least. So your savanna type species, so eucalyptus is one. So sorry, Californians, fire is not going to get rid of your eucalyptus problem. They're just going to regrow like chia pets and regrow their canopy this way. Some of our savanna oak species, so bur oaks and valley oaks out west, will do something maybe not quite this aggressive, but they're very prone to resprouting after fires. Really, any of your grassland tree species that are in more fire-prone areas are typically evolved to be resprouters after they get burnt. So, moving on into some of the usual suspects that I see as heavy resprouters. I have, I think, 3 disclaimers up on this slide before I talk about them. The first is that when I say likeliness to resprout or how heavy they resprout, I don't necessarily mean the speed at which the branches regrow. I mean the number of sprouts that the tree will produce. So it's not necessarily the same as how quickly they'll grow back, but how many sprouts they'll produce, like this eucalyptus growing back into the power lines already with thousands of resprouts. Obviously, regions are going to make a big difference on this. Things that are heavy resprouters in Missouri may not be as prone to regrowth in Minnesota, and individual trees are always going to vary. So there are my disclaimers. Got those out of the way. Here are just a non-exhaustive list of some of the heaviest resprouters. We have our mulberries, all of the species of mulberries, pretty much all elms, every eucalyptus species I've encountered in the U.S. at least. Your white type oaks specifically, so Water oaks, especially for those of you down in the deep south, water oaks are pretty heavy resprouters and pretty fast ones at that. Hackberries, poplars, pretty much all of them, and silver maples specifically from the maple groups. Box elders too. I don't have them listed on this slide, but they're another one. Willows, some fruits, in particular crab apples, are pretty guilty of this, and lindens. So these are all trees that have strong epicormic growths. They produce a lot of sprouts. Trees that have more moderate epicormic growth, the rest of the maples, your red type oaks, ash trees, sweet gums, conifers, nuts. So they're kind of in the medium category. It can kind of depend upon how the pruning was done and a few other factors as well. And then, interestingly enough, one that is considered to be a weak resprouter is sycamores. And to me, that's kind of ironic because they're one of the fastest regrowing trees out there. They'll only produce a few sprouts, maybe 3 to 5, but they will be very fast. They will grow back rapidly and turn into new big branches pretty quickly. So again, heavy resprouters aren't necessarily the fastest to grow back, and vice versa, but it is always nice to know which one some of our problem trees are going to be. So about halfway through, just like I said, how exactly can epicormic sprouting be controlled? Well, if you want guaranteed control, there isn't any. Thank you for coming to my talk. I can't see the three of you that are probably laughing at that, but for real, I do have a few things we'll talk through. The three are going to be herbicides, so things that you can typically spray on a tree, proper pruning techniques, and I have a lot to say on that subject, and of course, tree growth regulators, which is how I know anything about any of this to begin with. So we'll step through a few examples of each of these and things that can be done to help control that resprouting. So herbicides. Cut stump herbicide in particular is the first one I'll talk about here. I mentioned what happens when you cut down a tree, but you leave the stump there and you don't grind it out. If you're not going to grind it out and you don't want that tree to grow back, especially if it's one of those heavy resprouters, you're going to want to do something about that. We see this a lot in places we've done a lot of work with hackberries in particular, Siberian elms, box elders. The list goes on, but those are probably three off the top of my head that are the most aggressive at becoming whole new trees out of stumps that were left behind. So cut stump herbicides can be applied to the cut stump as the name applies, or name suggests, and they prevent that resprouting. It has to be done correctly. So this middle picture here probably does one of the best examples of showing because it's got the blue dye. You want to make sure that it gets all the way around the edges, all of that old living tissue, so the xylem and the phloem, all of that has to be covered as well as at least a couple inches down the side of that remaining stump. So you want to get full coverage around that stump to make sure it does not produce any new sprouts. It is systemic, so it should prevent other sprouts from happening further down the stem, but it has mixed results. So usually I take a heavy hand with this stuff if I am doing it to make sure I get that entire coverage. Probably my favorite active ingredient for cut stump, and there's a few different you can choose from, are going to be herbicides like triclopyr because they are targeted and because they have a relatively low environmental impact, and they are also very effective. So triclopyr products are the ones that I would go to for cut stumps. Another place that we'll see herbicides, particularly in the utility side of the industry, and for those of you who are not in the utility world, sorry to be the one to introduce you to the concept of chemical side pruning, but it's a thing. It can be pretty effective, again, when done appropriately. It's something you'll see occasionally on areas where you're not right up against somebody's property or they're less maintained areas out in the middle of nowhere. There are numerous different chemicals that are used for this process. It just gets sprayed down the side or down the sides of these rights of ways. One of the ones I've learned a lot about in recent months in particular is ones that contain phosphamine ammonium. And the reason this one's kind of cool is because it forces bud dormancy on recent cuts. So we talked a lot about how after you cut off the big branch of the tree, all those dormant buds have a chance to get activated. Well, if you have something in there that's going to force dormancy on them and they don't get to activate in the first place, that's going to be a pretty big win. The drawbacks for spraying this stuff in mass, obviously, because you end up with some areas that don't grow back and it might look not so good to observers. But if done on an individual branch, there's a University of Minnesota study that looked at using phosphamine ammonium for buckthorn control. in particular. And so it was sprayed kind of as a cut stump method as well, right on the cut buckthorn, and was again targeted, low environmental impact in that case, and pretty effective as well. So I know a few foresters who are experimenting this. There's some challenges, there's some drawbacks. It's hard to do on a large scale on just the fresh cuts, but there's some people who are trying it out. So I'm looking forward to reading more about that as more people are playing around with it. Proper pruning techniques. I think a lot of the problems we run into with trees growing right back into the power lines in particular are because of the way the tree was cut probably 10, 20 years ago, maybe more, before some of us were even in the industry. And now we're stuck continuing to recut them that way. In an ideal world, pruning near power lines is going to follow directional pruning practices. So what we're aiming at doing here is removing only the branches that are growing towards the power lines and encouraging growth away from the lines by leaving branches that have the directional growth that we're looking for. So essentially selecting the new branch or the new limb that we want to take on that apical dominance and leaving that one in place so it grows away from the tree and we don't have nearly as many sprouts coming downstream from the new dominant branch. So that's cool about this picture, and I took this one out in Missouri. That is a Siberian elm. And the forester tells me that there used to be, I don't know how well you can see it in this picture, but there used to be a primary line, a conductor up top here, and it's gone. So the tree's pruning outlived the conductor that was up there, and 20 years later, it's still growing away from the power lines that aren't even there anymore. And he says he hasn't had to touch that one since. So when done correctly, it can have pretty great effects further down the line with regards to not even having to touch that tree again. So proper pruning techniques, I rushed through this last line on here, but of course we're going to follow everything that it says in the A300. We're not making flush, or we're not making flush cuts. We're not leaving stub cuts. We're trying not to remove more than a quarter of a canopy at a time. I have this slide in here because I had somebody insist to me once that they leave stub cuts like this because, hey, if you leave at least a foot or two, any decay won't get back to the branch as quickly. And I'm like, maybe, but probably not. Probably not. It'll get there quicker than you think if it does decay. And if it doesn't, what's this tree doing? It's respouting. It's growing back. This is a live oak, and it is very much so alive and rapidly regrowing. You can't see the power lines, but they are up here directly above this stub cut that was left in place. So don't leave stub cuts. There are no good scenarios that creates. Instead, again, we're going to focus on our good directional pruning practices. So you'll see these referred to as heading cuts or releadering. If you're in the nursery industry, is a pretty common term. It's all the same concept, where we have a structural objective, and in this case, it's to get the branches to grow away from the power lines. So if you are not a utility forester, you look at a tree like this, and this one is in Oregon. I think it's a red maple, and you can tell it's in Oregon because you can't see anything resembling blue sky out there. Um, you might be tempted to think, oh God, what did they do to that poor tree? But if you look very closely at the areas I've got circled in yellow, those are just chef's kiss, beautiful examples of directional pruning, of these heading cuts. So you look closely here and you see that we've got larger branches and still decent size, smaller but decent sized branches going off in the direction that we want them to grow. So rather than just cutting all of these off and kind of leaving this flat top, these shelf prunes, I often hear them called, we are leaving some branches that have growth going away from the lines in hopes that those branches will assume that new apical dominance and prevent resprouting downstream on these inner branches that are under the power lines. So we want growth out here on the edges. We don't want it here in the middle. If you've ever wondered why you see those big, beautiful V cuts, those prunes around trees that you see sometimes, that's part of why. We're trying to get the growth to be on those upper outer parts of the canopy and not in the middle of the tree under the power lines. Unfortunately, there's not a ton of information on the best way to do this in the A300s. You got to do some Googling to find some really good trainings on how. Fortunately, Lindsay Purcell over at Purdue University has a pretty good guide on how to get some of these things done. So the first rule you're going to want is that the new leader needs to be at least a third of the diameter of the old leader. So looking at this example of a tree here, let's say that this branch here is 3 inches in diameter. This one down on the bottom here would be too small, probably because it's less than an inch. This one over here, though, on the right is at least 2 inches, so it's way more than a third of the diameter of the old leader, and it's a good option for that new growth. So making sure that our new leaders are big enough to be able to produce enough of those auxins to assume apical dominance is a pretty important factor. Then when making the cut, we want to follow all of the other usual proper pruning techniques. So we want to leave the branch collar intact, and we don't want to do a flush cut. We kind of want to split the difference here between the angles of the new leader and the old leader, leaving that branch collar intact. So again, Lindsay Purcell has some more images and some more information on how exactly these cuts should be made if you're interested in reading more into that. One of the other rules we want to follow here is we want to avoid bench cuts, which are going to produce vigorous regrowth. So what I mean by that one here in this picture is we have a branch that is pretty close to horizontal. It's at more of a 180-degree angle to a vertical. And because it's at a horizontal, it's got all sorts of rapid vertical regrowth. The reason this happens, even though this is a pretty large branch, is again, the auxins produced in an apical meristem do require gravity to some extent in order to have that influence on the branches downstream. So when you have a totally flat branch like this, whatever auxins might be produced at this branch tip are not really doing anything to suppress any of these dormant buds down further in the branch, and they're free to just grow back as rapidly as they can. And in this case, vertically right back up towards the power lines, which I'm sure are above this picture somewhere. So your new leader should not be a horizontal branch. It does need to at least be at a 45-degree angle. So here's an illustration from University of Georgia Extension that kind of illustrates what we're looking for here. You cut off this old leader and you leave it pretty close to horizontal leader, you're going to end up with 5 or 6 new vertical branches coming right back up. Instead, well, this is kind of scary to do, especially if there's power lines up here. Leaving, part of this vertical one and leaving a new leader that is growing off at a 45-degree angle is going to suppress all those possible vertical resprouts from this branch further down the line. And you're going to end up with, kind of 2 new leaders going off at a 45-degree angle in either direction. Again, University of Georgia has a pretty good set of images that support this and some more guidance that they can give. So 45-degree angle is the best for balanced growth. New leaders that are vertical are going to grow back too rapidly, and new leaders that are horizontal are going to end up with several new vertical sprouts growing right off of them. Again, sometimes you'll hear that called a bench cut. So we want to avoid those. And thinking back to that tree.jpg, that ash tree I showed you right at the beginning, that was a great example of why the horizontal leaders are going to be bad, and they're just going to shoot right back up towards the tree. Here's another look. Again, we got another live oak. Rapid resprouting coming off of this horizontal bench branch, and in the background we have a diagonal one, and relatively few resprouts coming off of it because most of that growth is going on the higher part of that canopy off to the right. So kind of wrapping it up here with the proper pruning techniques, at least, is a look at this sweet gum, where I'll be honest, when I took this picture, I wasn't sure if this was just a bad cut, or if it was somebody who was attempting to use directional pruning and just applied it incorrectly. But regardless, this one is a good illustration of kind of 3 very common mistakes that I just listed are made. So the first, of course, is it's a stub cut. There's really no reason to not take that back to the branch collar here. The second is the new leader is attempting to leave is way too small. This tiny little twig is not going to have really any impact on gaining apical dominance over this branch. So in this case, that really should have just taken back to the stem. But I also want to make it clear that I understand a lot of utility foresters are kind of stuck with the scope of work that has been developed or that they've had to work out with the cities they're in. I've definitely seen places where the agreement is they can take 10 feet and not a twig more. So you end up with some of those beautiful C cuts where nobody really wants to do that. But that's how the scope was written. So that's how it ended up being. So if you happen to have any urban or municipal foresters on this call, please work with their utilities in ways that don't make the problem worse. That's my public service announcement for the day. So, oh, hey, there's my ash tree again. So again, here's the example of those horizontal benches I was talking about earlier, and that's why we saw so much heavy resprouting coming from those spots in particular. So with our proper pruning techniques, there are some limitations. A lot of the stuff I talked about is kind of in our perfect world. One of the biggest limitations we're first going to see is that for anybody doing any mechanical work where they've got the sky trimmers crawling out in the wooded areas. It's not super easy to do proper pruning techniques when you're using a 60-foot pole saw mounted to a crawler. Um, I usually see not great proper pruning done with those things, but they're out in the woods and the tree individual tree is usually less of a concern. The other big limitation, and probably one of the biggest ones for utility foresters I encounter who would like to do more of these directional prunes, is that once you get a tree that looks like this, like our ash tree over here, there's really no amount of proper pruning that's ever going to bring this thing back into a good structure for the tree. You're kind of stuck with this one until you're finally able to remove it, which is, of course, eventually what happens. So, um, without like branch by branch annual pruning on these things, they're hard to get back to growing into a good form. So you're kind of stuck with the bad prune jobs once it starts up. Finally, too, you can do everything right, but trees are going to do what they want to do sometimes, and so these results can be difficult to predict, even if you do the proper pruning techniques and proper directional pruning. Sometimes trees are just going to be the way they're going to be. The last of the control methods I wanted to talk about, and again, the whole reason I dove into any of this to begin with for myself, is tree growth regulators. And I'm specifically talking about paclobutrazol. It's the one that we use exclusively when we're doing tree growth regulators for trees under power lines, and we do it as a soil injection around the base of the tree. As can be seen here, where's my mouse? As can be seen here by this technician, treating this honey locust. Um, it is a gibberellin inhibitor that we're using. So think back to the slides where I talked about the tree branches getting stretched out, kind of like Laffy Taffy. That cellular elongation that causes that rapid branch regrowth. If we can prevent that hormone from being produced in the first place, that gibberellic acid, then we can prevent those branches from growing back as rapidly as it do. And that's exactly what's happening here. So the comparison picture I have up here is a northern red oak. On the left, you can see the darker green one that is a shorter branch in comparison to the lighter green one on the right, which had not been treated. A few other kind of examples of the results that we see with using tree growth regulators. On the far left here, we've got sweet gum, which is probably one of the most rapidly growing trees I have encountered, where, again, after 1 year, the difference is a few feet versus maybe less than a foot. Um, Live oaks is another one where we see a ton of great response. The difference in a few feet, usually about 50% reduction in growth over the course of a few years. And one of my favorite examples, until one of my friends lost these twigs, I had saved them for years to take a closer look at, and then he just lost them. I'm over it. I got new twigs. We've got a cottonwood here out in Utah, where this one which is on the left side of this picture here, that's like 6 months of growth of a cottonwood that I'd plucked off a tree that had been pruned that had been pruned somewhat recently in a power line. On the right, this whole branch, ground to shoulder, is 4 years of growth of the cottonwood, and that's just this tiny amount that's above my hand here, maybe a few inches. That's the last year of a tree in the same parking lot that we had treated with paclobutrazol. So pretty dramatic results in many cases with comparison to the growth control. One of the cool things too about TGRs, as long as I got you on the screen here, is the increase in a different hormone, which again I can and probably will do a whole nother hour on this exact phenomenon. But since we're reducing the amount of gibberellic acid, we're increasing a different hormone called abscisic acid, and what we're going to see with that is more chlorophyll production and more protection against things like drought stress. So the tree is actually healthier for us having used this product on it, and the benefit to the utilities is that it grows a lot slower as well. So again, I can say so much more about this subject, and I have a whole nother hour, which we won't do today. We'll do that another time, I think. One or two more examples here, just to kind of bring this one home. We have live oaks out in Mobile, Alabama. These are the same species of tree. They were pruned at the same time. The one on the left here was treated with paclobutrazol, and the one on the right was not. And you can see even after a year, just the number of resprouts and those lighter green leaves versus the darker ones. So these are the results we're really looking for when we're out there doing those TGR applications under power lines. There are some challenges with TGRs. Again, not everything is perfect. We can't use them on all possible species that are out there. So here in this picture, we've got a basswood on the left that we treated 3 years ago, and it's holding really, really well. We don't typically do conifers, so this Colorado blue spruce on the right, trimmed all the way to the stem, so it's not growing back too much anyways. But we can't do treatments on conifers. We can't do treatment on edible species like English walnuts and some of those, and we don't do dogwoods either, is the last one we won't typically do. One of the other challenges we run into with tree growth regulators, and this is more of a program management one than anything, but it is an additional expense at the beginning because we time these at the same time as pruning, and we're looking for savings in the long run, which we do see. We typically see utilities saving money, especially on their mid-cycle pruning in the future. But it's always hard to convince whoever controls the budgets that they got to spend a little more at the beginning to save money in the long run. Finally, with that too, it does require proper timing and application techniques. It's not as easy as just buying a bottle of the stuff and pouring it out around the tree. You got to have proper dosing. You got to have proper measurement and identification of the tree. You got to time it to be really close to when that pruning happens to make sure you're getting the best results so that you see those savings in the future. So integration into the veg management program is often a challenge at tree growth regulators as well, and one that I relish in helping people work through as they're starting to get programs started with their utilities. In the last thing I'll say about this is if you've ever taken, any kind of pesticide applicator light exam, or if you're into the concept of integrated vegetation management, the best management techniques are the ones that use the right type of control method in individual circumstances rather than trying to force a one size fits all on every single tree in their system. So the best practices are going to be using a combination of these things, right? So proper pruning techniques plus TGRs, removals where possible, plus herbicide, cut stump, especially when you do those removals, and of course promoting right tree, right place, so that we don't have some of these trees growing in the right of way to begin with as we're planting new trees or building new developments. So IVM is of course using multiple techniques and the best one in each individual area. So that's what I personally would always recommend is looking at a combination of these different methods that I discussed. All right, so I'm going to pause here. Feel free to screenshot this one if you want to try and get some of those references that I talked about as we go along. And Jessica, you're here. I don't know if we got too many questions that came up, but I'm happy to answer any right now that have.
Yes, so if anyone would like to ask Liz any questions, please put those in the Q&A and we'll take a few minutes here to answer them. While we wait for those to come in, just a reminder, if you have any questions, obviously reach out to Liz. Reminder that if you didn't provide us your contact details and ISA number to record you for your ISA CEU, please put that also in the Q&A. Yeah, let's give it here a few minutes. If there are no questions, then we can call it a great webinar. Thank you so
So if
much.
there's any that get typed in while I do my last little spiel here, that'd be great. Otherwise, do feel free to reach out to me if any come up later on. I'm pretty easy to find on LinkedIn, and generally I'll respond to those within a few days if you do shoot me something there. I am doing 2 more webinars this summer, on June 17th and then July 18th, I believe. Once I get the CEUs formally approved for those, I've got them submitted, I'll have more information coming out about those. So keep a lookout for those if you like new if you like hearing me talk, whether you need the CEUs or not. I'll get info posted about that. Um, Not a question, but oh, thanks, Robert. I appreciate that. Is there a chemical application that can be used on pruned branches that won't kill the tree? Yes. So that's the one I was talking about a little earlier. Scrolling back super rapidly here. All right, so phosphate ammonium. Now, I want to specify that I don't work with this stuff myself. I do not have personal experience working with this one. So, the only brand name I know of this one is called Krenite, I think, with the Krenite. But phosphate ammonium is the active ingredient in that one, and that's the one that buckthorn study I was talking about, University of Minnesota did specifically to control buckthorn that they had recently cut. I know a forester who is experimenting with having the actual pruners up in the bucket trucks spray this on branches, and he's got his budget structured in a very interesting way. So I know not everybody's going to be able to do this because it is an additional expense, an additional time. But he's trying it out. He's seeing how it does, and he's hoping to get a white paper published when he starts seeing the results from the trials he's doing with that right now. But if you want to look into that one, that's the one I've heard about that you can spray on specifically the pruned branches, right? You spray this on the fresh prune cuts. You don't spray this on the branches. If you spray it on the live branches, you end up with brownout like this. So if you're looking for one to spray on live branches that'll stop it from growing, there are plenty out there that'll do that, but not that won't kill the tree or cause brownout that I'm aware of at this point. Where would I put Bradford pears? High. I'd put them in the high category. I don't know why I didn't have them listed in my list here, but I'd say Bradford pears would fall in this high category just because they're like a lot of fruits. They produce a lot of sprouts, and they do grow back pretty rapidly as well. So I would say not one of my favorite trees, probably one of my least favorite trees, and one of the more common ones we run into in terms of having to treat them and keep them out of the power lines. Great question. Any others?